There is a particular kind of ambition that belongs to nations in transformation. Not personal ambition, something larger. The ambition of a people who have looked at the world around them, decided that the old ways are insufficient, and resolved, with a kind of furious collective energy, to remake themselves entirely. Japan in the 1870s was that kind of nation. The Meiji Restoration had opened the country to the world after centuries of deliberate isolation, and what Japan saw when it looked outward was both inspiring and humbling. Western nations had built industrial empires on steel, steam, and engineering. Warships that dwarfed anything in Japanese waters. Railways connecting continents. Factories that worked around the clock. Japan had talent, ambition, and pride in abundance. What it needed was someone to translate those qualities into iron and machinery. Shozo Kawasaki was that someone. He founded his first shipyard in Tokyo in 1878, a modest beginning, a single facility with a simple mission to build Western-style ocean-going vessels, because Japan needed ships and needed to learn how to build them itself. He was practical, driven, and clear-eyed about the gap between where Japan was and where it needed to be. By 1886, he had relocated to Kobe and established a larger operation. By 1896, the company was formally incorporated as Kawasaki Dockyard Company, Limited, and Shozo, recognizing, with unusual selflessness, that the company needed management beyond his own, handed the presidency to a 31-year-old named Kojiro Matsukata. It was one of the shrewdest decisions in Japanese industrial history. Matsukata would lead Kawasaki for 32 years. He was expansionist by instinct, visionary by temperament, and tireless in his determination to turn a regional shipbuilder into a national industrial power. Under his direction, Kawasaki didn't just build ships. It built the infrastructure of a modernizing nation. In 1906, it opened a factory producing rolling stock, railway carriages, locomotives, the arteries of a country learning to move at speed. It expanded into steel production. It moved into automobile components. And then, like all great industrial companies of that era, it felt the gravitational pull of the newest frontier. It looked up, and it entered aviation. By the time the company renamed itself Kawasaki Heavy Industries in 1939, it had become something almost impossible to contain within a single description. Ships, trains, aircraft, engines, steel. A zaibatsu, one of the great industrial conglomerates that formed the backbone of Japanese economic and military power, with thousands of workers, multiple facilities, and deep integrated connections to the machinery of the Japanese state. And then the machinery of the Japanese state went to war. The flying swallow. In wartime, an industrial giant does not choose its products. The state chooses for it. Kawasaki's aircraft division became one of the most important in Imperial Japan. While other manufacturers concentrated on radial engine fighters, the dominant technology in Japanese aviation, Kawasaki's engineers took a different path. They licensed a liquid-cooled engine from Germany, the Daimler-Benz DB601, the same power plant that gave the Messerschmitt Bf 109 its edge over the skies of Europe. They studied it, adapted it, and built their own version, the Kawasaki F40. And around that engine, they built a fighter. The Ki-61 Hien, Flying Swallow, entered service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in 1942. It was unlike anything else in Japanese skies. Sleek, long-nosed, liquid-cooled, fast. When Allied pilots first encountered it over the Pacific, they were confused. It didn't look Japanese. It looked European. The United States War Department, unable to identify it, initially assumed it must be a Messerschmitt. They gave it the Allied reporting name Tony, a vaguely Italian sound for a fighter that seemed, somehow, to belong to a different war. Over 3,000 Ki-61s were built. They flew against B-29 bombers over Japan. They defended the home islands. Some of their pilots, in the desperate final months of the war, used them in ramming attacks against American aircraft, the ultimate expression of a military machine consuming itself. In 1944, American bombers struck the Akashi factory where Kawasaki built its aircraft engines. The production line for the H-40 was destroyed. Hundreds of completed Ki-61 airframes sat in a factory with no engines to power them, finished ghosts, waiting for a war that was already lost. Kawasaki's engineers improvised, fitting a different engine and producing one final variant, the Ki-100, before the war ended in August 1945. And then everything stopped. Japan surrendered. The war machine fell silent. And the silence that followed was not just the silence of peace. It was the silence of a nation under occupation, its industry surveilled, its future controlled by the authority of the American forces now administering the country. Kawasaki Heavy Industries, the Zaibatsu, the empire, the machine that had built warships and fighter aircraft and railway carriages for half a century, was broken apart. The American occupation authorities dismantled the Zaibatsu structure deliberately and methodically. The goal was clear. Never again would a single industrial conglomerate be capable of equipping a war machine. Kawasaki was separated into its constituent parts: the shipbuilding division, the rolling stock division, the aircraft production facilities, each entity now standing alone, stripped of the integrated power that had made the whole so formidable. The empire had been cut into pieces. Whatever it takes. Survival in the immediate post-war years was not a strategy. It was a daily negotiation. The factories were standing. The workers were still there, men with extraordinary skills in precision manufacturing, in metalwork, in engineering, who had spent the war years building some of the most technically demanding machinery ever produced in Japan. But the products they had been building were forbidden. Aircraft production was banned under the terms of the occupation. The warships were gone. The military contracts had evaporated overnight. What do you do with a factory full of aircraft engineers and no aircraft to build? The answer in those first desperate years was anything. Kawasaki's facilities produced pots and pans, farming tools, industrial machinery, basic consumer goods, whatever could be made with the tools available and sold to a population that had almost nothing. There was no dignity in it, and there was no pretense that it represented a future. It was survival. It was keeping the lights on and the workers fed while the country figured out what it was becoming. But inside the engineering departments, something more purposeful was taking shape. Kawasaki's aircraft engineers, the men who had designed and built the Ki-61, who understood liquid-cooled engines and precision tolerances at a level few people in the world could match, turned their attention to a new problem. Japan needed personal transportation. The roads were damaged, the railways were overloaded, and the automobile was beyond the reach of almost every ordinary citizen. What the country needed was something smaller, more affordable, more accessible. What the country needed, in other words, was a motorcycle. In 1949, Kawasaki's engineers designed their first motorcycle engine, a 148 cubic centimeters four-stroke unit, designated the Ki-1, a name that meant exactly what it said: Kawasaki Engine No. 1. It was small, practical, and deliberately modest, a beginning, not a statement. In 1953, the first complete Kawasaki motorcycle reached the market. The Phoenix had its first feathers, but no one yet knew how far it would fly. The resurrection. Rebuilding an empire is not a single dramatic act. It is 1,000 decisions, each one adding a layer, each one extending the structure a little further into the future. Through the late 1950s and the 1960s, Kawasaki rebuilt. The occupation ended. The restrictions on aviation lifted. The company began reintegrating its separated divisions, a process that culminated in 1969 when Kawasaki Heavy Industries merged back together with its former subsidiaries, reconstituting something close to the scale and diversity of the original Zaibatsu. But the world had changed. Japan had changed. And Kawasaki, to its credit, understood that rebuilding the past was less interesting than building the future. The motorcycle division grew. It competed in racing, first in motocross, developing a reputation for performance engineering that would become the foundation of everything that came next. By the mid-1960s, Kawasaki had its first Grand Prix racing program. The engineers who had once built combat aircraft were now applying the same principles: lightweight, high power, aerodynamic efficiency, mechanical precision to two-wheel machines. And then came Honda. In 1969, at the Tokyo Motorcycle Show, Honda unveiled the CB754. It was, by any measure, a revolution, the world's first mass-market four-cylinder four-stroke superbike, with performance that made everything else on sale look suddenly obsolete. The motorcycle world stopped and stared. Kawasaki had been developing its own four-cylinder machine, 750 cubic centimeters project internally known as the N600. The Honda announcement landed like a bomb in the engineering department. The N600 wasn't good enough anymore. It wasn't fast enough, wasn't powerful enough, didn't do what needed to be done. The response at Kawasaki was not panic. It was something more interesting: competitive fury. The brief was rewritten. The displacement was increased from 750 to 903 cubic centimeters. The engine architecture was upgraded to a double overhead camshaft configuration, DOHC, a technology previously found only in racing machines. The project was given a new code name, one that captured perfectly the ambition and the appetite of the engineers working on it. They called it New York steak, the most desirable cut, the richest thing on the menu, the fastest thing on two wheels. The Kawasaki Z1900 was unveiled to the world in September 1972 at the IFMA motorcycle show in Cologne, Germany. In a country that had been stripped of its industrial identity less than 3 decades earlier, a Japanese company was now presenting, to the global capital of engineering culture, the most powerful production motorcycle ever built. The numbers were extraordinary. A 903 cubic centimeters inline-4 engine, 82 horsepower at 8,500 revolutions per minute, a top speed of over 130 miles per hour, 210 kilometers per hour, that made it, in 1973, the fastest production motorcycle on Earth. And not just fast, but beautifully engineered. The double overhead camshaft layout, the slim and aggressive proportions, the 4 exhaust pipes sweeping back from an engine that looked almost too purposeful to be street legal. The Z1 wasn't a motorcycle. It was a declaration. It declared that Kawasaki had arrived, not as a survivor of defeat and occupation, not as a cautious rebuilder of lost glory, but as a genuine world leader in performance engineering. That the precision skills developed building wartime aircraft had been transformed, without loss of intensity, into something entirely peacetime, entirely joyful, entirely alive. The market responded accordingly. The Z1 became a phenomenon. 85,000 units sold between 1972 and 1975, celebrated on racetracks across America and Europe, coveted by riders who understood that here, in this machine, was something genuinely new in the world. Today, original Z1s are among the most sought-after collector motorcycles in existence, physical artifacts of a pivotal moment. But the Z1 was not the endpoint. It was the opening statement. The Z-Series became the foundation of a global brand identity defined by performance, by engineering ambition, by a refusal to settle for second place. Kawasaki became and remains one of the 4 great Japanese motorcycle manufacturers, alongside Honda, Yamaha, and Suzuki, that collectively rewrote what motorcycling meant in the 20th century. The shape of reinvention. Today, Kawasaki Heavy Industries is a company of almost incomprehensible breadth. It builds commercial aircraft components and military helicopters. It builds the bullet trains that cross Japan at over 300 kilometers per hour. It builds submarines for the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the same naval infrastructure that the occupation authorities once tried to permanently dismantle. It builds industrial robots, gas turbines, hydrogen energy systems. Its motorcycles, the Z-Series, the Ninja Series, the legendary H2, are ridden on every road on Earth. The Phoenix did not just survive. It expanded. But here is what makes the Kawasaki story different from a simple tale of corporate resilience. The company did not rebuild by returning to what it had been. The occupation authorities ensured that was impossible, and in doing so, they may have done Kawasaki the greatest favor in its history. Forced to abandon the monoculture of wartime production, forced to find new products for a new world, forced to apply world-class engineering skills to civilian needs rather than military ones, Kawasaki discovered something about itself. It discovered that the skill was never really about aircraft or ships or trains. The skill was about engineering itself, about the relentless application of intelligence and precision and competitive fire to any problem worth solving, about refusing to accept that the current state of anything, a motorcycle engine, a bullet train, hydrogen fuel system, represents a ceiling rather than a floor. Shozo Kawasaki, the shipwright who moved from Tokyo to Kobe in 1886 with a vision and a determination, would not have been surprised by any of this. He understood, better than most of his contemporaries, that the product is temporary, but the capability is permanent. You build ships until the world needs something else. Then you build that. His successors built fighter aircraft until the world needed motorcycles. Then they built the fastest ones on Earth. And now they are building the energy systems of a future that hasn't arrived yet. Because that is what industrial phoenixes do. They do not wait for the fire to pass. They climb into it, find what survives, and build something the world has never seen. The name on the factory says Kawasaki. It always has. It always will. Not what it was. More than it ever was.